Well, next week's Zimbabwean elections are being described as historic, and not just because it will be the first time that longtime ruler Robert Mugabe will not be on the ballot paper. For many, these might be the most important elections in the country's post-independence history. The fairness of many of the polls in the past decades has been called into question, with Mugabe's government accused of not playing fair and human rights abuses in order to stay in power. Will these elections be any different? Well, looking at this important question is Amnesty International, and I'm now joined by the organization's Deputy Regional Director for Research for Southern Africa Muleya Mwananyanda. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, so you released a report recently called Breaking Away from the Past, a Human Rights Manifesto for Zimbabwe's Political Parties and Candidates. And I just wonder, in broad terms, what did this briefing tell us?
Well, the briefing told us about the past that we've observed as Amnesty International and the abuses or the violations that we have documented over the years. So we've been working in Zimbabwe for over 40 years now. And over the past 37 years, we've documented a number of human rights violations. And the briefing is speaking to those violations and calling upon the government to address some of the violations that we've observed over the years. So, for example, the briefing talks about enforced disappearances and torture. So a culture of impunity that had developed over so many years. A lot of people tortured or disappeared. We've spoken very, very strongly about the disappearance of Itai Dzamara, for example, which is a more recent case in 2015, but there have been so many other disappearances that have happened over the years. So from 2000, for example, in that election, we know that David Coulthard's polling agent, Patrick Nabanyama, was disappeared. We don't know where they are. A lot of people have been disappeared. There's a number of them that we can't even account for. Kane Kala, for example, has been disappeared.
So they've disappeared and never to be found.
Yes.
And typically, what were the reasons for these disappearances? Were they activists? Were they politically motivated? What was going on?
So most of the disappearances have really been motivated by the fact, what we've seen a pattern of over the years is that most of the people that are disappeared are those that have a dissenting voice to that of the government. So there's that pattern that has emerged. So there's obviously a correlation to that. And what we find really difficult is the fact that none of those disappearances have been accounted for, except a few. So, for example, Justina Mukoko has lived to tell the tale about her disappearance, but even she was disappeared because there was a suspicion that she was against the government. So what Amnesty International is calling for is for the government to ensure, whichever government comes into power after the election, to ensure that justice is served and that the families of those that have been disappeared are dealt with, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going into an important set of elections. In the past, there's been an escalation of suppression of journalism and political activities of opposition parties. What have you observed in the run-up to these elections? Has it been quite different from the past?
Well, these elections seem, so we were in Zimbabwe last week, and what we observed was there is some semblance of peace on the streets, and we were also very surprised that at the launch of our report that various political parties came to the launch, which is something we haven't seen in many years. So we hope that, this is a change coming, a positive change coming. But what we observed in past elections has been completely different. So it was gruesome. There have been deaths that we've documented in 2002, 2008, all of those things that we don't want to see happening in this year's election. So we're really, really hoping that it doesn't get as bad as it's been in the past.
So you're going there for the elections, you'll be observing as well. What are you going to be looking out for?
So we're going to be looking out for any forms of violations on the ground. So do people have, during the poll itself, is there freedom of people to go and cast their vote? Because, the Constitution says people have the right to choose a person of their choice? Are people being prevented? Is everything okay? But we're also looking at whether people have been attacked in their houses. As you know, in the past, there have been people who've been attacked in their huts or their houses burnt down because they belong to a particular political party. So we'll be looking out for any signs of violations.
It is interesting. You know, your report talks about breaking away from the past, and there seems to be, when people look at this story, the time when Robert Mugabe was president and after, and it suggests that he alone must have been responsible for all the state atrocities. Can that be true, that he did this alone? I mean, how is it that suddenly everything is fine, inverted commas?
Absolutely, no, you're completely right. In fact, it wasn't him alone, and if you look at our report, you see, for example, where we talk about security forces, that there's impunity by security forces. So there are various people in those security forces, so the police, the army, we name all of those. If you look at the people we've documented in Gukurahundi, for example, in the 80s, that was a whole state operation, so it wasn't one person that was involved in that, which is why, as Amnesty International, we're saying that it has to be a systematic change across all of the state institutions to ensure that human rights of people are protected.
So let me get this right then. You're suggesting that the people who are still in charge were very much part of the atrocities that you observed in the past, and for whatever reason, I don't know, they've seen the light or something's happened, that they're behaving differently.
Well, we hope that things do change now, because as you rightly put it, I mean, Emmerson Mnangagwa was in government when we've been documenting human rights violations that have taken place. But again, he's not acting alone. So there are so many people. So it's a whole overhaul that is required. And whichever government comes into power, we are calling on them to observe human rights. So, for example, ensure that there are no enforced disappearances, that the death penalty is dealt with, that women have access to sexual and reproductive health services, which we have documented as well in Zimbabwe as not being present for women.
The president has said out very clearly, we don't need to beat people, we don't need to use violence, that's not the way we do things now. And I suppose that this is an important thing because, you know, often the language that the former president used was very belligerent and almost insightful. So this president seems to be saying the right things. One wonders if the soldiers on the ground are going to heed that word. What's your gut feeling from what you've observed?
Well, it's been quite positive, and we're calling for the government, whoever comes into power again, to ensure that whatever the current president is saying is what happens, so that the security forces start getting their message that impunity will not be allowed. So we are hoping that this kind of language is the language that continues going forward, because previously, as you've rightly said, it's been very difficult. The police were actually, or the security forces were actually emboldened because of the language that was used by Robert Mugabe. So it will be important for the new government that comes through to use human rights language. What we've noted, though, is that although he has said no violence, he's spoken a lot about Zimbabwe being open for business. So we hope that being open for business also means being open to ensure that human rights violations are a thing of the past in Zimbabwe. Okay,
Muleya Mwananyanda, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and hopefully we'll catch up with you. We've got a whole team going up to Zimbabwe for these elections. Perhaps we can have a conversation there.
Absolutely, we'll be there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.